Dr. Patricia Sullivan carefully handled the delicate photograph as she sorted through the medical archives at Harvard Medical School. The basement collection contained thousands of historical documents related to mysterious deaths and medical anomalies from the 19th century. This particular photograph had arrived as part of an estate donation from a prominent Boston family, the descendants of Dr. Edmund Morrison, a physician who had practiced in the 1890s. The image was a formal studio portrait, clearly expensive for its time. A prosperous family posed in the elaborate Victorian style typical of Boston's upper middle class in 1892. The father, seated in an ornate chair, wore a fine dark suit with a gold pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His wife stood gracefully beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture of wifely devotion. Her elaborate dress, complete with bustle and intricate lace details, spoke of considerable wealth and social status. Two small children completed the portrait. A young boy stood beside his father's chair, dressed in a sailor suit that was fashionable for children of wealthy families. A little girl in a white dress with ribbons sat on a small stool, her hands folded primly in her lap. On the back of the photograph, written in careful Victorian script, was the notation, "The Whitmore family, October 1892. Charles, Eleanor, Henry, and Catherine, Dr. Sullivan, whose specialty was researching historical cases of poisoning and their medical symptoms, had been drawn to this collection because Dr. Morrison had kept detailed records of unusual deaths in late 19th century Boston. She was particularly interested in cases where families had been affected by mysterious illnesses that might have been intentional poisoning. The Whitmore portrait seemed like a typical example of Victorian family photography, formal, prosperous, and dignified. But something about the father's expression caught Dr. Sullivan's attention. While the rest of the family appeared healthy and content, Charles Whitmore's face showed subtle signs that her trained medical eye found concerning. She set the photograph aside for closer examination, not yet realizing she had discovered evidence of one of Boston's most carefully concealed murders. Back in her office at Boston University, Dr. Sullivan used the latest digital scanning technology to examine the Whitmore family portrait in detail. Her research into Victorian era poisoning cases had taught her to look for specific physical symptoms that period. Photographers often inadvertently captured in their formal portraits. The high-resolution scan revealed the photograph's remarkable clarity. Victorian studio photography, when done by skilled professionals, could capture extraordinary detail. As she zoomed in on each family member, Dr. Sullivan made careful notes about their apparent health and demeanor. Eleanor Whitmore appeared vibrant and healthy, her complexion clear and her posture confident. The children, while maintaining the rigid formality expected in Victorian portraits, showed bright, alert expressions, typical of well-cared-for offspring from prosperous families. But Charles Whitmore's appearance told a different story. When Dr. Sullivan magnified his face, she noticed several troubling details that would have been invisible to casual observers. His eyes showed a distinctive yellowing around the irises, a subtle discoloration that could indicate liver damage. The skin around his eyes appeared slightly puffy and discolored, suggesting chronic illness. More significantly, his pupils appeared constricted, despite the bright studio lighting necessary for photography of that era. His overall complexion, while still maintaining the pale tone fashionable among Victorian gentlemen, showed an underlying grayish cast that Dr. Sullivan recognized from her research. Most telling was his posture. While seated in a position meant to convey authority and prosperity, Charles appeared to be gripping the arms of his chair with unusual tension. His shoulders were slightly hunched, suggesting chronic abdominal discomfort. Dr. Sullivan had seen these exact symptoms documented in medical literature from the 1890s, describing cases of chronic arsenic poisoning. The combination of liver damage, pupil constriction, skin discoloration, and digestive distress formed a pattern she recognized immediately. She began searching Dr. Morrison's records for any mention of the Whitmore family, her suspicions growing with each detail she observed in the photograph. Dr. Sullivan's search through Dr. Edmund Morrison's medical files proved immediately fruitful. She found a thick folder labeled Whitmore, Charles, private consultation, October-November 1892. The file contained detailed medical notes, correspondence, and even a copy of Charles Whitmore's death certificate. According to Dr. Morrison's records, Charles had first consulted him in early October 1892, complaining of persistent digestive problems, fatigue, and what he described as a general malaise that has plagued me for several months. Dr. Morrison's examination notes described a man in apparent good health who nonetheless displayed concerning symptoms. Patient reports increasing stomach distress, particularly after meals, Dr. Morrison had written in his careful script. Complexion appears somewhat sallow, and patient mentions frequent headaches and difficulty concentrating on business matters. Most concerning is patient's report of metallic taste in mouth and occasional numbness in extremities. Dr. Sullivan's pulse quickened as she read these symptoms. They formed a textbook description of chronic arsenic poisoning, though Dr. Morrison, working without modern toxicological knowledge, had diagnosed Charles with nervous dyspepsia brought on by business pressures. The file contained multiple consultation notes spanning October and early November 1892. Charles had returned to Dr. Morrison repeatedly, his symptoms gradually worsening. The doctor had prescribed various treatments popular in Victorian medicine, tonics, digestive aids, and rest cures, none of which provided relief. Most significantly, Dr. Morrison had noted that Charles's condition seemed to fluctuate unpredictably. Patient reports feeling somewhat improved on certain days, particularly when traveling on business, but symptoms returned with increased severity upon his return home, one entry noted. To Dr. Sullivan, this pattern was unmistakable evidence of intermittent poisoning. The symptoms would improve when Charles was away from the source of the arsenic, then worsen when he returned home to his regular meals. The final entry in the file was dated November 15th, 1892. Patient deceased this morning. Family reports sudden deterioration overnight following evening meal. Cause of death, acute gastric fever with complications. Charles Whitmore had died just 3 weeks after the family portrait was taken, and Dr. Morrison's unknowing documentation had preserved evidence of his murder. Dr. Sullivan's next step was researching the Whitmore family's financial situation and what had happened to Eleanor after her husband's death. Boston probate records from 1892 were meticulously maintained, and she found Charles Whitmore's will and estate proceedings at the Massachusetts State Archives. The documents revealed a complex and suspicious financial picture. Charles had been a successful textile merchant with substantial investments in Boston's growing industrial sector. His estate, valued at over $45,000 in 1892 dollars, equivalent to well over $1 million today, had been left entirely to Eleanor with provisions for the children's education and care. However, Dr. Sullivan discovered something troubling in the legal correspondence attached to the probate file. Just 2 weeks before his death, Charles had scheduled an appointment with his attorney to revise his will. According to a letter from the law firm, Charles had expressed concerns about his wife's spending habits and wanted to establish a trust that would limit Eleanor's access to his capital. The appointment had been scheduled for November 20th, 1892. 5 days after Charles' death. Even more suspicious was what Dr. Sullivan found in Boston city directories and society records from the period following Charles' death. Eleanor had waited exactly 1 year, the minimum proper mourning period for Victorian widows, before marrying James Hartwell, who had been Charles's business partner and closest friend. Marriage records showed that Eleanor and James had wed in a quiet ceremony in November 1893. Property. Records revealed that the newlyweds had immediately sold Charles's textile business to a competitor for a substantial profit, then moved to a mansion in Boston's prestigious Beacon Hill neighborhood. Dr. Sullivan found Newspaper Society columns from 1894 describing the couple's lavish entertaining and extensive travel. Eleanor, who had been described in Charles's lifetime as a devoted wife and mother, had transformed into one of Boston's most prominent socialites. The children, Henry and Catherine, had been sent to expensive boarding schools immediately after their mother's remarriage. School records indicated they spent holidays and summers with relatives rather than returning home, suggesting Eleanor's new life had little room for reminders of her first marriage. The financial motive for Charles's murder was becoming undeniably clear. Dr. Sullivan's investigation took a crucial turn when she discovered a collection of personal correspondence in the archives of the Boston Historical Society. Among papers donated by the Hartwell family descendants were letters between James Hartwell and Eleanor Whitmore, dating from the months before Charles's death. The letters, written in the flowery language typical of Victorian correspondence, initially appeared to be innocent communications between business associates. James frequently wrote to Eleanor about matters related to Charles's textile business, updating her on transactions and market conditions. However, as Dr. Sullivan read more carefully, she began to notice underlying currents of intimacy that went far beyond business relationships. In a letter dated August 1892, James wrote, "Dearest Eleanor, I find myself counting the hours until our next meeting to discuss the Manchester shipment. Your insights into these matters continue to astound me, though I confess it is your company I treasure most during these consultations." By September, the correspondence had become more explicitly romantic while maintaining a veneer of business propriety. "My beloved Eleanor," James wrote, "the burden of maintaining this pretense grows heavier each day. When you speak of Charles's increasing suspicions regarding our business meetings, I fear for what the future may hold. Yet I cannot bear the thought of a life without you." Most damning was a letter from Eleanor to James dated October 10th, 1892, just days after the family portrait was taken. "My dearest James, Charles grows more suspicious and difficult each day. His illness seems to make him paranoid about my activities, and he has begun questioning my household expenses in great detail. Dr. Morrison's treatments provide no relief, and I fear Charles is becoming desperate enough to take drastic measures regarding our future security." The letter continued with chilling calculation. I have been reading about cases of arsenic therapy for various ailments. Dr. Richardson's medical journal suggests that small doses can be beneficial for certain conditions, though he warns about the dangers of excessive treatment. Perhaps Charles's condition might benefit from such therapy, administered with the care only a loving wife can provide. Dr. Sullivan realized she was reading Eleanor's confession, written in code but unmistakably describing her plan to poison her husband using the guise of medical treatment. Armed with evidence of Eleanor's intent to use arsenic, Dr. Sullivan searched for records of how she might have obtained the poison. Arsenic was commonly available in 1890s Boston, sold openly in pharmacies, for various legitimate purposes, including rat poison. In certain medical treatments, the Massachusetts Board of Health had required pharmacies to maintain detailed records of arsenic sales since 1888, following several notorious poisoning cases. Dr. Sullivan found these records preserved in the state archives, meticulously documenting every purchase of arsenic-containing compounds in Boston during the relevant period. Her search revealed multiple purchases by Eleanor Whitmore at Pemberton Pharmacy on Beacon Street, a reputable establishment that served Boston's wealthy families. Between July and November 1892, Eleanor had purchased arsenic-based rat poison on 5 separate occasions, each time citing persistent rodent problems in the cellar stores. The pharmacy records included detailed notes by the proprietor, Mr. Samuel Pemberton, who had known the Whitmore family for years. His entries showed growing concern about Eleanor's frequent purchases. Mrs. Whitmore, again requesting rat poison, mentioned a previous purchase seemed ineffective, suggested consulting with pest control specialist. The customer insisted on handling matter personally. More suspicious was Pemberton's note from October 1892, Mrs. Whitmore's 6th purchase this year, unusual quantity for household use. Customer appeared nervous when questioned about effectiveness of previous treatments. Recommended consulting husband about potential alternatives, but Mrs. Whitmore stated Mr. Whitmore was too ill to be bothered with household matters. Dr. Sullivan calculated that Eleanor had purchased enough arsenic to fatally poison several people. The timing of her purchases corresponded exactly with Charles' medical consultations with Dr. Morrison, suggesting she had been carefully calibrating her doses to create the appearance of natural illness while gradually weakening her husband's constitution. Most telling was Pemberton's final note, November 14th, 1892. Mrs. Whitmore requesting something stronger, as previous treatments had proven inadequate. Sold compound with higher arsenic concentration. Customer seemed agitated and insisted on immediate need despite late hour. Charles Whitmore had died the following morning, less than 24 hours after Eleanor's final fatal purchase. Dr. Sullivan realized that if her theory was correct, the Whitmore children would have witnessed their mother's crime, even if they hadn't understood what they were seeing. She began searching for any records that might contain the children's perspectives on their father's illness and death. Her breakthrough came through an unexpected source. The records of Dr. Margaret Thornton, one of Boston's first female physicians, who had specialized in treating children from wealthy families. Among Dr. Thornton's patient files, Dr. Sullivan found records for both Henry and Catherine Whitmore, treated for what we would now recognize as childhood trauma in the months following their father's death. Dr. Thornton's notes revealed disturbing details about the children's home life during Charles's final months. Henry, the older child, had told the doctor about frightening changes in his father's behavior and appearance. The boy reports that his father became increasingly ill-tempered and confused, Dr. Thornton had written. The child states that father would sometimes seem not to recognize family members, and would accuse his wife of trying to poison him during particularly difficult episodes. Catherine's testimony was even more specific. The 4-year-old had described watching her mother prepare special meals for her father, adding medicine to his food that other family members did not receive. The child demonstrates with dollhouse figures how mother would stir powder into father's soup and tea, Dr. Thornton noted. When asked about the powder, child states it was to make Papa feel better, but adds that Papa got sicker instead. Most significantly, both children had described their mother's behavior during their father's final night. Henry reported hearing his parents arguing loudly, with his father accusing Eleanor of trying to kill him. Catherine had seen their mother giving their father extra medicine during dinner, despite his protests that it tasted bitter and wrong. Dr. Thornton's records showed that she had been deeply concerned about the children's accounts, particularly their detailed descriptions of their mother's suspicious behavior. However, her notes indicated that when she attempted to discuss these concerns with Eleanor, the widow had immediately withdrawn the children from treatment and transferred them to a boarding school outside Boston. The children's testimony provided crucial eyewitness evidence of Eleanor's methodical poisoning of their father, observed by innocent victims too young to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Dr. Sullivan's investigation revealed how Eleanor had successfully concealed her crime from authorities and society. Victorian Boston's social conventions and limited forensic capabilities had worked in Eleanor's favor, allowing her to escape detection despite leaving clear evidence of her guilt. The key to Eleanor's success had been her careful cultivation of the image of a devoted wife caring for an increasingly ill husband. Dr. Sullivan found numerous social correspondences where Eleanor had described her husband's deteriorating health to friends and relatives, consistently portraying herself as a dedicated caregiver struggling with a mysterious illness. Eleanor had been particularly clever in her choice of poison and delivery method. Arsenic poisoning could easily be mistaken for various common illnesses of the era, especially when administered in small doses over time. The symptoms Charles experienced, digestive problems, fatigue, confusion, and eventual collapse, were consistent with dozens of conditions that Victorian medicine poorly understood. Dr. Sullivan discovered that Eleanor had even manipulated the medical investigation into her husband's death. Through careful research, she found that Eleanor had specifically requested Dr. Morrison to examine Charles. Knowing the physician's reputation for conservative diagnoses and his reluctance to suggest anything as scandalous as deliberate poisoning in a respectable family, when Charles had accused Eleanor of poisoning him during his final weeks, Dr. Morrison's notes showed he had dismissed these claims as delusions brought on by fever and digestive distress. The doctor had even counseled Eleanor about the challenges of caring for a husband whose illness was affecting his mental state after Charles's death. Eleanor had ensured that no autopsy was performed by citing religious objections and the family's desire for a quick burial. Victorian sensibilities about respecting the dead and avoiding scandal had supported her position, and no authorities had seen reason to question the death of a man who had been visibly ill for months. Eleanor's remarriage to James Hartwell had been the final stroke of genius. By waiting the proper mourning period and marrying her late husband's trusted business partner, she had transformed what might have appeared suspicious into a romantic story of consolation and mutual support during grief. The Victorian era's social conventions had provided perfect cover for a carefully planned and executed murder. Dr. Sullivan's research revealed the full scope of Eleanor's sophisticated criminal plan. This had not been a crime of passion or desperation, but a carefully orchestrated murder designed to appear natural while maximizing Eleanor's financial and social benefits. The timeline Dr. Sullivan reconstructed showed that Eleanor had been planning Charles's death for at least 6 months before executing her plan. Her affair with James Hartwell had begun in early 1892, but correspondence suggested they had discussed the problem of Eleanor's marriage as early as spring that year. Eleanor had researched arsenic poisoning extensively, using the Boston Public Library's medical collections to study symptoms and dosing. Librarian records, which Dr. Sullivan found in the library's historical archives, showed Eleanor had borrowed numerous medical texts about toxicology and treatment of digestive ailments during the summer of 1892. Most remarkably, Eleanor had used the family portrait session as a calculated element of her plan. Dr. Sullivan discovered that Eleanor had scheduled the October 1892 photography session specifically to create a final family memento before Charles' anticipated death. The portrait served multiple purposes. It documented Charles' visibly declining health, established Eleanor as a devoted wife and mother, and provided a sentimental artifact that would discourage future suspicions about the family's happy appearance. Eleanor had even manipulated the timing of Charles's death to coincide with his planned will revision. By accelerating her poisoning schedule in mid-November, she had ensured Charles died before he could change his will to limit her inheritance. The large final dose of arsenic, purchased the day before Charles's death, had been intended to prevent any possibility of his recovery or discovery of her activities. After Charles' death, Eleanor had systematically destroyed evidence while appearing to grieve appropriately. She had disposed of remaining arsenic supplies, replaced household items that might contain residue, and even redecorated the dining room where Charles had consumed most of his poisoned meals. Eleanor's marriage to James had been planned from the beginning, with the couple carefully maintaining separate residences and minimal public contact during the mourning period to avoid scandal. Dr. Sullivan realized she had uncovered one of the most sophisticated murders in 19th century American history, committed by a woman who had understood both the scientific and social elements necessary for the perfect crime. Dr. Sullivan completed her investigation in 2024, over 130 years after Eleanor Whitmore had successfully murdered her husband and escaped all consequences. Her research had uncovered overwhelming evidence of the crime: medical documentation of arsenic poisoning symptoms, pharmacy records of Eleanor's poison purchases, children's eyewitness testimony, correspondence revealing motive and planning, and the studio portrait that had captured Charles Whitmore's dying moments. The investigation revealed how Victorian society's limitations had enabled Eleanor's crime. The era's primitive forensic science, social conventions that protected wealthy families from scandal, and legal systems that rarely suspected women of calculated violence had created perfect conditions for her to commit and conceal murder. Eleanor had lived a long and prosperous life after killing Charles. Records showed she had remained married to James Hartwell until his death in 1923. Continuing to move in Boston's highest social circles, She had died peacefully in 1934 at age 78, having never faced any suspicion or consequence for her crime. The Whitmore children had suffered throughout their lives from the trauma of witnessing their father's murder. Henry had struggled with alcohol and mental health issues before dying young in 1905. Catherine had remained unmarried and reclusive, spending her final years in a private sanitarium where she repeatedly told nurses about watching her mother poison her father. Stories dismissed as delusions from a disturbed woman. Dr. Sullivan published her findings in the American Journal of Criminal History, titling her article, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Whitmore Family, Portrait in Victorian Boston's Perfect Murder. The revelation that Eleanor's crime had been documented in a formal family. Photographs sparked international interest in the case. The original studio portrait now hangs in the Harvard Medical School Museum of Historical Pathology, serving as both educational tool and memorial to Charles Whitmore. Enhanced digital analysis clearly shows the symptoms of arsenic poisoning in Charles' eyes and complexion, evidence that Eleanor never suspected would survive to expose her crime. Eleanor Whitmore had committed the perfect murder for her time, but modern technology and historical investigation finally revealed the truth. Charles Whitmore's suffering, captured forever in that 1892 family portrait, stands as testament to both human evil's capacity to hide behind respectability and justice's eventual triumph over even the most carefully concealed crimes.